You're listening to Informed Dissent. If you're a longtime listener, welcome back. If you're new, welcome, and here's the lay of the land. I'm Jamie Reed, a lesbian and a whistleblower who worked inside a pediatric gender center. My co-hosts are Lauren Legere, also a lesbian and a longtime LGB advocate. Our other co-host is Corey Cohn, a gay man who underwent gender transition early in his life. All three of us come from the left, and none of us fit the story you've been told about who questions gender medicine. And that's not an accident. Every week, we will cover the headlines you need to know across medicine, law, sports, schools, and prisons. And then we dig in. The three of us, and most weeks, a guest worth hearing from. We built this show because we believe that the most important conversations about gender politics are the ones happening between people with real stakes and real disagreements. Free inquiry, honest argument, and dissent that's worth something because it's actually informed. Welcome. Welcome to Informed Dissent for this week, Saturday, June the 13th. I'm Jamie Reed. This week we're doing something a little bit differently. A single dedicated interview, no headlines. Lauren and the team are headed to Chicago for the Endocrine Society's annual conference. You'll be hearing about that action soon. In the meantime, if you're missing your weekly news, we do have you covered. Our weekly news roundup goes out every week on our Substack. It's one of the only things we put behind a paywall, but it's well worth it. And this week, our interview will be the whole thing. If you've spent any time thinking about medical ethics in America, you have probably encountered the work of our guest, Arthur Caplan, without even knowing it. He's the man who made bioethics a public discipline. In the early 1980s, he brought bioethics out of the academic journals to the people who needed it, patients and families. He's the founding director of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Before that, he built the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania from scratch. He's the author of 35 books and more than 880 peer-reviewed papers. So, by most measures, he's considered the most prominent bioethicist in the United States. I want you to understand what his career was built on because I think it matters for what you're about to hear. In 1991, Caplan secured the first formal government apology for the Tuskegee syphilis study, the 40-year experiment in which the U.S. Public Health Service withheld a known cure from Black men in Alabama, lied to them about what was being done to their bodies, and watched them die. He didn't just write it, he pushed and pushed until the apology came from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. He later helped secure a 2012 apology from the German Medical Association for German physicians' roles in Nazi experimentation. His career was built on the premise that medicine can do profound harms to vulnerable people, and that institutions will protect themselves often before they will protect their patients. I know what some of these things feel like from inside an institution. I was inside a clinic where I felt that something had gone very, very wrong, and I wanted to reach, as far as the system would allow, to find someone within the institution whose job it was to see what I was seeing and at least investigate and consider doing something about it. In my final years at the Washington University Transgender Center, I was part of a process that actually sought out an ethics consult for one of our patients. It was a young man who had a puberty blocker implanted in his arm, who I believed and his mother believed had been profoundly failed by this intervention. His mother later told that story to the Free Press. He finally got the implant removed, and he has desisted. What I remember most about that consult was not the case itself. It's what happened to the clinical ethicist as he started asking us general, basic questions. He was troubled. He kept asking questions, not about this patient, but about our intake practices, about our patient population, about the interventions, the things that we are doing. Something in him was registering that the problems in the center were not contained to one singular chart. But then nothing changed. Not because that ethicist himself was captured or corrupt, and not because he didn't care, but because at that point, the field had moved so far, so fast, with such institutional momentum, that even a genuinely concerned clinical ethicist couldn't figure out which lever to pull within this institution. I felt like I had called an emergency helpline, and I came to find out that no help was coming. So when I think about people like Arthur Caplan, I think about that local ethicist who saw the problem and had no platform for which to act. Caplan is in many ways spent the last 50 years building these kinds of platforms. He is not inside our movement. He's going to make that very clear. But I feel like we need to keep talking to the people who are one step removed, who have the standing and the credibility and the institutional relationships that some of us who blew the whistle no longer have. When I sat down with Arthur Caplan, I knew I was going to be talking to someone who doesn't really agree with me. And I think a lot of regular listeners know where I personally stand. I left the transgender center in 2022 because I believe children are being harmed. And I have come to support many legislative efforts to roll back those interventions. Caplan looks at some of the same evidence and has reached a different conclusion about what should happen next. He acknowledges that some things have gone wrong. He's not completely dismissive of the concerns, but he absolutely does not believe state legislatures are the right instrument of remedy. And he will tell you why in this interview in his own words. And he's also going to make very clear that he stands on one side of a political divide. And that divide may be the thing that we most need to find a way across. What I want you to listen for is this. This is a man who has built his entire career holding medicine accountable to its most vulnerable patients, engaging with cases where I believe we know accountability has failed, and listen for the distance between where his analysis takes him and where mine takes me. One more thing before we begin. Some of you I know are going to say that you wish that I pushed harder, and I completely understand. I made a conscious choice not to. Not because I feel like I or we lack the arguments, but I think right now the moment, and this podcast is calling for something different. I'm trying to crack some windows open. What happens next is also not completely up to me. If you're an ethicist, a researcher, a clinician with data and a point of view, I think that Arthur Caplan is reachable. He thinks that the medical journals are reachable. So when the journals reject your papers, as some will, send them to him anyway. I think that this conversation is yours to continue. I am handing you a contact and an opening, so I hope you find ways to use them. The conversation in my interview with Arthur Caplan on informed dissent is up next. Thank you so much, Dr. Caplan, for being willing to come on Informed Dissent and talk with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I want to start out with some of the basics, things that I know you know a whole lot about. Our audience, I think, is incredibly well informed, but you're an expert in a really important field. So my first kind of foundational questions, I would love it if you could explain to us, what is medicine supposed to do? Not what it happens to do or not what a patient wants from it, but what is its actual purpose?
Well, it's a great question. Might take up our entire time to answer it, but Uh, I'll try to summarize. Medicine's first job, I believe, is to fight disease and disability and try to restore function and preserve function. Already that's controversial because some in the MAHA movement might say medicine's first job is to promote the avoidance of disease, to be prophylactic, not therapeutic. But I don't see it that way. I think the first duty is to try and help those who have troubles, problems, illnesses, diseases, health challenges. Then comes the promotion of health. And I think medicine has a role to play there, although it's not unique. There are roles to play there for everybody from people preparing food in the home to try and preserve health, all the way out to agricultural businesses and chemical industries, which can pollute,
Sure. Yeah.
things in a way that damage health. So it's bigger than medicine. That's why I don't put it as medicine's first job.
It
Uh,
sounds like maybe there's medicine and then there's public health.
yeah, and
Okay.
I would accept that division. Last job, which I think is emerging, and I'm not sure is always wrong, is to try to optimize one's health. So we see that in sports medicine, trying to see who can run fastest and so forth with the right diet, sometimes with controversial drugs, but that's debatable. But we also see efforts to optimize health coming in areas like prosthetics, or you might have interventions in mental health that are supposed to increase your mental health, positive mental health, make you not just less anxious, but maybe give you more capacities to function. And certainly in fields like neurology, where we start to see implants beginning to occur into the brain directly, I can imagine someone saying, part of my mission is to enhance the capacity of the brain, not just treat diseases. And I'll give you one example where we try to do improvement every day, although we're losing our grip, and that's vaccines. Vaccines are immunity boosters. They make our immune system stronger than they normally would be. Oddly enough, that seems threatening to many people in terms of safety or whether that's the route they want to take to protection against disease. But it is a good example of enhancement, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. So I know you've worked a lot about compassionate use and addressing this kind of specific tension where there's patients who are suffering and they want access to maybe an unproven treatment. And we know that their desperation is real. But you've also argued that that desperation cannot be the sole justification for bypassing an evidentiary standard. So basically, is there a point at which offering unproven treatment to a desperate patient is itself exploitive? Maybe like kind of why not?
Well, first, the goal of medicine and medical research is to provide people with safe and effective products, safe and effective devices, um, safe and effective treatment. The road there is through standardized methods that, we refer to shorthand clinical trials.
Okay.
So the first duty, I think, of people who are involved in as sponsors of drugs, little companies, people in the discovery process, whether they're academic or wherever they might be, regulators, both local and national, is to serve that end. And that means trying to encourage or insist upon participation in clinical trials of things. Even if some rumor has it that ivermectin is great, that's rumor, that's hearsay, that's testimonial, it isn't evidence. It's maybe suggestive that it might be good to put it in a clinical trial. I'm okay with that. Does a clinical trial always mean that you have to take a placebo? No, I think that is not the only route to knowledge. Sometimes you can compare two interventions against one another. It just means a longer trial.
Okay.
Uh, Sometimes you're in a situation where you don't want to withhold something that's partially effective in order to get something that's better than what you have. Cancer faces that all the time. It has somewhat partially effective interventions, but they're horrible because they make us sick, and they're difficult for the patient to tolerate. If you want to go to the next generation, let's say, of cancer treatments that use genetic interventions and precision medicine, I wouldn't say put the cancer patient on a placebo in a trial
Okay.
and then just give half of them the new thing. That's not ethical to do either. So sometimes it's slower because you have things that are partially effective, somewhat effective, but you want to get better medicines. In any event, before handing out anything to anybody, you want to know, is this in a trial? Is the trial open to the individual with the problem? Can they
Okay.
get to it? Can they participate? Some can't. And then, are there situations where people are so sick that they wouldn't be eligible for a trial because you can't really learn? They have too many comorbidities, they're dying. That's the group that probably has moral priority to compassionate use, preliminary access.
Okay, so I love that you're talking about kind of experiments here. So I'm a clinical research coordinator. Can you kind of talk through for the audience what is supposed to distinguish experimental medicine treatments or drugs from what is called the standard of care? And is there an ethical consequence of calling something a standard of care before the evidence base is like fully there? I
Yeah,
just
so on the latter
route here.
question, one group that's a little bit prone to that, I'm going to call it sin of declaring something a standard of care before it really gets there, is surgery. So there are all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. They don't have them in a clinical trial. And lo and behold, whatever it is declared the standard of care, partly because some guy did it, I don't know, 20 times in a row and had a good result. And that, however, is a problem because you don't always know whether somebody can replicate what led to the good outcomes because you didn't have it in a controlled trial. Is it just surgical being adept at
Yeah.
some
Yeah. Was it
intervention? Is
his
it
skill?
something else?
Yeah.
Another field that's classic for this is reproductive medicine. Some centers produce babies at a very high rate and have for a long time and declare that the standard of care. And other places can't seem to make babies at all, and they don't know why. And because we don't have it in a trial, we're not sure what the variables are. Is it embryo selection? Is it the humidity in the lab when you're trying to bring sperm and egg together? We don't know. So standard of care sometimes gets declared by what becomes common in practice, but that doesn't really make it verified, doesn't really make it sound. It just says some people have been able to do this repeatedly. Maybe you want to look into that, but to me, I still think those things should be put more into trials so we can figure out. Sometimes we're doing things that work, but we're doing excess things that we don't have to do. You can eliminate some stuff, but you don't know what it is because you haven't really put it in a trial against I'll call it slimmest intervention that will produce a good outcome as opposed to something that's carrying a lot of other baggage, which you don't really have to do. We've seen some of that, for example, in bloodless surgery. When Jehovah's Witnesses say, I don't want to take any blood, some programs have attempted to develop surgery for very complex conditions with no blood. And that's really interesting. But the hint is the people who were using lots of blood in the surgery may not have ever studied how much they really needed. And when they really needed it, it just worked. So nobody pulled it apart and said, gee, we don't really have to use that much transfused blood to do a transplant or a bypass or whatever they're going to do. In any event, without going on and on about this, what's experimental, I think the paradigm is you don't know the outcome with any real confidence.
Okay.
What's treatment is you do know that something has a benefit. It could be small with confidence in a warranted way, meaning you can supply evidence, you can supply support for your belief in what's going on. Sometimes that's the results of a trial. It may be an observational study. You're comparing somebody who got this against a group who didn't get it just because that was how it was distributed or something. And that might be enough evidence to say, I've got something here. It's not always randomized clinical trial. Frequently the best method, but not the only method.
Okay. So I want to touch a little bit on kind of my background. And I think it's a follow-up question around standard of care versus experiment. So I worked in a center and saw about 1,500 patients, and many of them were treated under a practice that was being called the standard of care. But they've come to later believe that they were in an experiment without knowing that, without kind of going through the clinical research protocols. And now we have a couple of governments that have said, yes, that this is still in an experimental phase. What do we owe to those patients? And are there ever periods where we go too fast and we have to pull back and say this isn't standard, it needs to come back into an experimental framework?
Yes, hopefully rare, but yes, we have had situations where somebody thought, I've got enough evidence. And then what happens is you put it out in the world and you're dealing with people who aren't, let's say, selected according to relatively narrow trial conditions. But once it's out in the real world population, older people, younger people, even though it's been declared an approved therapy by regulators, sometimes you get a recall, if you will, and somebody says, this works okay if you're 20 to 45 and don't have any other problems. But if you're 65 and your kidneys are weak and you've got other issues because of aging, this isn't working. And in fact, it's dangerous. I don't think we spend enough time in our system in what's called phase 4 evaluation. The last step is always monitor the release of approved things into the general population. Everybody, and you know this well from your own experience, the selection of people to be in clinical trials is is very, very narrow. I mean, actually, you're trying to rule out people who have problems or issues, even pregnancy, that
Yes,
might complicate.
or they're on another medicine, or they
Yeah,
have a diagnosis.
so
It's
they've
so,
had three
yeah,
prior
okay.
treatments. We see this in gene therapy. Somebody can't be in the fourth trial because we worry they're sensitized because of the prior three, and they're going to have a bad reaction. But all of a sudden it goes out in the world, and somebody who had three prior exposures is now getting what's seen as the beneficial gene therapy intervention or whatever it might be. So
So
in the world, yeah,
let me just ask this then. In those cases where it has been kind of brought back, um, did the did the clinicians bring it back on their own? Do you feel like were they open to acknowledging, let's bring it back? Okay, because when you're talking, the first thing that came to mind was mesh. So
yeah,
the vaginal mesh, that was
yeah.
one where put
Remember
out
Vioxx?
and Vioxx. So it was put out and then it was, and my mom even had an experience with that, where that drug did work for some, but when it was put out, it
Yeah,
had to be pulled back. Those things, I know about those things because there were lawsuits and there was a lot of
yes.
conversation about it. Um, do
I
you
mean, the
see?
short answer is kicking and screaming to get something pulled back. People don't just say, hey, data's not so good, getting a lot of adverse event reports. The world of phase 4 in the US, overseas too, is weak. It relies on reporting from providers, sometimes patient adverse event reporting. It is not systematic. Things are missed that continue to be out there, even though they may not be working for anybody but a small group, but they're being given to a huge group. The person or persons making them don't want to pull them back. They're making a lot of money. Um, phase 4 is our weakest link.
Okay.
And it's the thing that we really have to boost more systematically. And I'll add something else to that. in compassionate use early access, the pressure is on, particularly from the current administration, to speed things up and give more access. And the general argument ethically is don't be paternalistic. If someone wants to take a risk and they're very, very sick, let them, let them decide if they want to engage in a risky new medicine without saying that the underlying animal data doesn't support it, or we don't have much in the way of underlying in vitro data. Just let them take the risk as long as they're informed that we don't know what the hell is going on here and it could kill you. Well, okay, that may be what the public wants. It may be what lobbying patient groups are advocating for. Some do, some don't. But if you're going to go that route, you have to then boost your reliance on phase 4. The faster you go and the speedier you go and the shorter the trials and the less the evidence before things are approved, the more likely things will go through, chance, luck, whatever, that don't reveal problems and don't reveal problems for things that can be pretty high cost these days. So you don't want a system that's spending a ton of money on ineffective or even dangerous things for the general population. The system we have historically has relied on what I'm going to call front-end protection. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Try to make sure nothing goes through that isn't going to be dangerous or won't work. The pressure is on now to speed up that front end, but the back end remains weak.
Okay, so the field that I worked in never went through phase 1, 2, 3, anything like that. So it started off in the Netherlands. And one of the things that I'm seeing right now in this field is that the evidence, let me just read this section to you. So it starts in the Netherlands with a physician psychologist by the name of Annelou de Vries. So she's a Dutch researcher whose studies, she co-authors these papers, and the original studies were talking about treating depression, anxiety, quality of life. Those are in like 2011. So 2024, she co-authors a paper in the BMC Medical Ethics and argues that evaluating this treatment protocol by measuring those same outcomes, depression, anxiety, quality of life, now imposes a problematic normative assumption that the effectiveness should instead be defined by whether patients achieve an embodiment goal. My question is this. So if you have a researcher whose data formed the evidence base for this clinical practice is now arguing a change in the metric of success, is that normally what we see in kind of an evidence-based practice, or would we want them to stick with the same?
Well, I want them to stick with what they proved. So the outcome metric should not vary.
Okay.
Do we see attempts to vary it? Yes. There are even attempts to say, look, what we're going to go by now is not whether the tumor shrunk, but we're going to watch markers that we think are predictive of tumor shrinking as an outcome. And we don't have to wait for the person to have a giant tumor. This is better. Let's measure the drug against what we can now predict, which we couldn't predict maybe when we did this trial, whatever, 10 years ago. So that's the happy version of that.
Yeah.
The sad version is you come in and you say, boy, people just seem anxious again. I'll make this up. After a month, their anxiety is returning. They're not getting much in the way of relief. So the person making the drug or the researchers or even the people prescribing it say, well, a month is not nothing and we still want it out there. So let's just accept the shorter time frame for relief. And just as long as we tell people, we thought you'd get a year from our studies, but turns out in the world, with all the biological differences that people have, that's really not what's going on. The problem here is shifting the goalpost may not be understood by the people prescribing. It may be understood by some. And you know who now sets the goalpost? The payer. So we spend all this time wondering, What's the FDA think? What's the EMAA think? What do the regulators think? What do the journals think? Do we have data? Somebody shows up later from the insurance company and says, a month anxiety relief. I saw that published. I'm not paying for that. So you can jump up and down all you want about resetting the goalpost. These days, particularly in the US, if payers don't like what they see, they stop paying.
Okay. Okay.
And that, again, I want to underline. We used to live in an era where if things made it through FDA, if things got approved, Medicare, government programs, and private insurance would just start paying. Today's era is the payers are much less willing to just accept an FDA approval and start paying. They don't. They sometimes want more evidence than what FDA was collecting. They sometimes say, I don't care. I'm not paying for that. There's a generic that's almost as good.
But also, I mean, I think one of the issues is we're talking about cost is so different. So when you're talking about this, I'm thinking of like the Alzheimer's drugs that were put out that FDA like barely approved.
Yeah.
And then yet, are wanting insurance companies to pay for, but these drugs cost like
a lot more.
Astronomical in costs. This is not paying. Okay.
So there, again, due to cost, the payers are not just, if you will, accepting what we might say is pretty good data from the FDA, from research studies, from competent trials. They won't. If it's really expensive, they will step in and say, until I get more data, I'm not paying. I've seen this a lot, by the way, in rare diseases. Somebody says we did this on 3 kids out of a population of maybe 50 that could have the disease, and the 3 kids did pretty well, and they were carefully monitored. And again, well, it's not a randomized trial. There's not a big enough number. It looks pretty good. And the payer says, hey, that's interesting. You come back when you've tried it on 10 kids.
Okay. Okay. So everything that we've kind of talked through so far, I am feeling this like sense of conflict because it feels to me like the field that I worked in, so this concept of pediatric gender medicine really went outside of a lot of the normative, what we wish would have happened.
Yeah.
Like, wish it would have gotten a better, like, we wish the trials would have been stronger from the beginning. We wish that.
And also the follow-up. Remember, I talked about phase 4.
Yeah.
So you want to know,
what happens
were people happy? Were they satisfied? Who killed themselves? Who felt disappointed? We don't have a good registry, which is part of what you're looking for in post-approval or post-dissemination of interventions like that. We must follow some cohort to see what's going on over time. It was, and I said this early, it's the height of irresponsibility to pioneer a major change in young people and not follow them in a systematic way or a subset.
So what do we do now? There was the ideal, what we should have done from the start. And I don't know how much you've been following this, but in the UK, they were trying to start up an actual study that would have tested the puberty blocker. Where does ethics come in now to tell us what to do now?
Well, we still have kids with gender dysphoria. So we need to figure out what is our approach going to be to them. I still believe it's never too late to start a trial, or at least an observational study of kids who went through it and where are they now. We could certainly look at that. There are people who did it and people who didn't, and we can
just
compare
to clarify, we could retrospectively go back to the kids, because this started in the US about 2008. So we could even go back and chart review or start
them, yes, and also compare them to people who didn't do it and what's happening with them. There are plenty of kids who didn't go through this. who said I'm not happy or whatever with my gender assignment. So the problem of treatment is still there. Now, that's what should happen. What will happen, because of the politics of this, because it's become so ideologically charged, nothing is going to happen for these kids for years because people are just leaving the field, programs are shutting down. The administration has made it clear that it wants nothing to do with any of this. When they give that speech, there are two genders, and that's the end of it, and you are what you were born with, and otherwise shut up about it. Nothing is being budgeted, nothing will happen. If there's any chance of even the retrospective study that I'm talking about, it's going to occur elsewhere outside US. Will not happen here. Politically dead in the water. And by the way, without enough protest from medicine, why are guys in state legislatures who run pesticide animal pest control companies dictating what doctors are doing for young children in their treatment plans? Where did it happen that all of a sudden the state legislature or the Congress is going to step in and tell you what you should and shouldn't prescribe? They could certainly step in and say what they want to pay for. I get that. That's part of their mandate. But they have
Okay.
no mandate to rule out interventions that a doctor thinks are, important or ought to be studied. And I don't hear organized medicine protesting those interventions loudly. When, I'll give you a different example. Pediatricians in Florida said, we want to talk about gun safety with parents of young kids. The Florida legislature said, you can't. You can't? Who, where is professional autonomy and the right to practice by evidence-based standards? The Florida legislature doesn't like that topic, so they're going to muzzle you. So we've seen a lot of power given up by organized medicine, running away in fear from a hostile administration, both at the state level and the federal level.
I find this fascinating because I think on one hand, you're seeing that the medical institute, like the AMA, the APA, you feel
Yeah.
like are pulling back. Um,
And by the way, Florida State Medical Association, Florida Association of Pediatrics, right down to the County Medical Society. I'm talking about all of them.
is it possible that they're pulling back because they did get a look at the evidence and they did realize that the evidence is not strong enough and maybe this is
No,
a pivot?
no,
You think they're pulling back out of just
fear.
political fear?
Yes.
Okay. I would want them to pull back because they looked at the evidence and they recognized we maybe did move too fast, too quickly, and
Yeah.
we needed. So, from my side, I can see a
I
criticism
mean, I could agree with that too.
both
I'm fine
sides.
with that, but I don't think that's what's happened.
Okay, here's my final
I think
question.
they got bullied.
You think, okay, so here's my final question, and it's about, in part, you have a long history with the Tuskegee study.
Yeah.
And you were instrumental in getting, was it HHS to
Yes.
essentially apologize?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that represents one of the worst failures in medical history and medical
Mm.
research, but it didn't happen necessarily because that there was just like one or two bad people. It was because you had this institution that, got to a consensus. They aligned all these incentives up. From my perspective, I know that there are many parents and many within medicine who feels like the way that pediatric gender interventions rolled out is akin or similar. And they feel like someday there will need to be a similar apology from
Mm.
HS or from some of the governments we see in Sweden, Finland, these very liberal governments who are
Yeah.
starting to roll this back. Um, Talk to me about your life's work in Tuskegee, and now there's people saying this might be a similar situation. Does it feel like that could be even possible, or?
Yeah. Well, just to remind people, Tuskegee started out with a good motive. Started out just to monitor and surveil what was the incidence of venereal disease in poor Black men in rural counties in Alabama. It did it with an alliance with the Tuskegee Institute, still around today as Tuskegee University with its medical school and so on. What really turned the study south was when a cure appeared, penicillin,
Yes.
during World War II. They didn't give it to the men they had been following, and they knew they had syphilis. And the men actually had heard about treatments for bad blood, as it was called, and asked if they were going to get it, still in the study, coming into the doctors. And the doctor said yes and lied. So, what we have is the intentional withholding of a known efficacious cure to a population of poor Blacks. The reason you said that's about as bad as it gets is it is about as bad as it gets. It is worse than what's going on with the pediatric uh, hormone treatment situation. Why? Because people knew there was a cure, intentionally lied to people that they were giving it to them. And the reason they did that is racism. They didn't care about these people at all. So they kept studying them to see the impact of end stage syphilis, viewing them as worthless. I'm going to put it that way, flat out. But they had a cure. We don't have that quite yet in the world of gender identification and transgender and transitioning. We have ideas, we have things that we're thinking maybe work. So I'm not saying that's not bad as how it's been managed, but Tuskegee got to the absolute bottom of the barrel because the subjects were lied to. They didn't get the cure. They continued to transmit the disease. They thought they were safe. They weren't. And the rationale for this is flat out racist. So
I,
that's a
yeah,
combo that's pretty bad.
yes, that is. What I find really kind of difficult to pull apart in the short time we have left is that there is a number of individuals. So I'm a lesbian.
Yeah,
Uh, there are a number of us who feel like the treatments that these interventions that have been offered to these kids, though, is because they have gender atypical, stereotypical, different presentations. And we feel like those are the same presentations we had as kids, and we
yeah,
grew up to be gay or lesbian. And so
yeah,
we feel like these kids are having things done to their bodies that didn't need to be done to their bodies. If they could have just been supported and left alone medically, they would have just grown up to be gay or lesbian.
yeah.
So I know that the Tuskegee parallel has a lot of differences, but I do want you to just know that there's a lot of adult gays and lesbians who feel like this is
Oh, I'm aware.
okay.
I track that little topic pretty closely, and I get
That's
the idea that there's bias
yeah,
on the part of society and even the medical profession against, a boy who says I want to be a girl
yeah,
or presenting in a certain way or whatever. And I don't doubt that there are. I don't believe the administration is right. I'm not a believer in the fact that there are two sexes. I think there are complications about that. There are people who are tweeners and people who are asexual, all kinds of, combos, if you want to put it that way. Um, so I think that's wrong. When to intervene, why to intervene, what to do about it is certainly fair to point out that it's taking place in an atmosphere where people are biased or still, bigoted against gay people. Let's
yeah,
just put it that way. I get
yeah,
that. On the other hand, if you're going to still try to do things because people say they're upset or worried or whatever, then I think you should be in a trial and you should have to justify why it is you're going to do things. We part of the reason here you're trying to control puberty. if that wasn't an issue, you just wait and see, as you said, what happens. It's sort of, but if you're going to do that, puberty blockers, you got to get there before puberty, and that sort of throws everything upon interventions with kids who we don't, as much as pediatricians say, they like to get the assent of children. I'm not a believer much in that. I think it's parents who are going to be making the call, and a lot of them have their own views about what they want their kid to be, or even listening to their kids' complaints or worries and want to
Yeah.
be helpful. So
Yeah.
very complex there. I guess at the end of the day, I do not believe I've seen evidence yet that says people who underwent this are 10 years out really happy. I'm not sure I've seen evidence that says a lot of them want to go backwards or reverse or do something else. All I can say here is I should, and there has been enough intervention for me to expect those answers. That's what I think those patients deserve. In a certain way, that's what the gay community or other communities concerned about treating gender
Yeah.
or sexuality deserve too. But are we going to get it? No, because again, there's too much bigotry out there in the current funding streams to even go do those simple follow-ups.
So I lied. I have one more question for you now. So you're one of the few bioethicists, I would say, in the world who will consistently, even if an institution doesn't want to hear it, you'll go on the record and you'll talk about challenging things. Looking at this field, do you think that bioethics has done its job the way it
No,
was supposed to?
no,
Okay.
no. You want to see more voice than we get and more debate and discussion. Look, I have a view. I could be wrong. That's fine. Once or twice in my 50 years, I've been wrong. Okay, it's happened. But it's really a topic that merits, a lot of debate, not just because of the vulnerability of the young
Yeah.
kids, but also because you're getting all this government intrusion into the practice of medicine and what can and can't be studied, and governments declaring what are medical facts. I don't think those are legislator jobs. And it really irks me all the time to see doctors yielding to politicians, not just about studying this area, but in general, okay, you don't want me to use terms. Look, where's all the debate about diversity, inclusiveness, and equity? Those are bad values, apparently. Are they really bad? Where's the protest? All we do is in universities watch everybody scrub them off of their websites or out of their grant proposals. I thought they were pretty good values. Still do.
How can
But
we get more bioethicists, though, to have the debate? So you're saying exactly what I agree with on this hand, though. There needs to be an openness in the field to have the conversation. How do we do that? How do we get that to happen?
probably one path is to request more participation at conferences. Would you like to do a panel? We're available. We would like to discuss this. Can you put it on the program at the bioethics meeting? Or, there are cousin groups like the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, where the health lawyers get into this, and they're another group that should be having more discussion. The other way is sending in the occasional op-ed or article. There are journals like the American Journal of Bioethics that the way they operate is to have a target article and then ask people to comment. So that fosters engagement. It's not just I declare as Art Caplan that this is the truth. And somebody has to, gets the opportunity to say he's a dope and, he's been wrong about everything for a long time. So whatever. Yeah, I think it's engagement. Don't write off the community, sort of chase them around a little bit is what I might say.
Well, I really appreciate your willingness to engage with me and to have this conversation. I am so pleased to have had the chance to speak with you. And I have some bioethicist friends who have been waiting to hear from you, and I hope that they might reach out to you after this interview airs. Okay?
Sure,
Perfect.
absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much for the time
All
today.
right, thanks for having me.
This podcast is produced by the LGB Courage Coalition, a registered United States nonprofit fully funded by small donations like yours. We work to promote evidence-based medicine, ending the medicalization of gender nonconformity, and advocating for LGB rights. Supporting this show means supporting that work directly. If what you heard today mattered to you, please like, subscribe, and pass it along. Word of mouth is how independent shows like this one survive. You can reach us in the Substack comments section or by email at lgbcouragecoalition@gmail.com or through the contact page on our website at lgbcourage.org. We want to hear from you. And until next week, stay informed and ready to dissent.